a massive thank you to Elspeth and George for being with us, and Owen for co-hosting tonight. Yeah, so just a bit of background then on the event. In fact, I'm just going to run a quick poll if Zoom will let me, just to see of the people that have joined us so far. If you've been to lots of LJC events this year, if this is your first one, yeah, just get an idea. Okay, cool. So we've got at least one person that it's their first event ever, and lots of people that have been to lots. Good. Always good to see a range. Okay, so well, for those of you or that one person out there that might not know me then or my business, my name is Barry Cranford. I'm the founder of the London Java community, and I also run RecWorks, which is a tech recruitment company. So at RecWorks, we're all about trying to find ways that recruitment can be a force for good in the tech industry, beyond just getting people jobs. So what that means is we're not just about getting people their next job, but we want to help people find a career that they really love, or find that passion for what they do, and then try and do what we can to help them go all in on it. So to give you a bit of a taste of what we do, we've built communities and user groups of over 10,000 people now. We've run over 800 learning-focused events, 125 this year since lockdown started. We've made over 3,000 mentor introductions now, and we do it all for free, or at least free for you guys anyway. So how it works is we're basically paid to find talent, developers usually, and then we take a chunk of that revenue and drive that back into our community initiatives. So this year we've been doing things a bit differently, and we've set up what we're calling ladder groups, and the idea is to bring people together that are climbing the same ladder or climbing similar ladders. So the aspiring speakers that I was talking about at the beginning is one example of that. We've put about 50 new people on stage or on screen so far. We've also got a group for aspiring CTOs, and the latest group that we've got is aspiring principal engineers. So we're looking to try and help people improve their core coding skills. So if you want to become the next speaker, a CTO, a principal engineer, a tech lead, or just looking for any mentor, then get in touch. You can find me on LinkedIn. Probably had about 10 emails from me over the last few weeks, so just answer any one of those. And of course, if you're hiring tech talent, then I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, on to this evening. So tonight we've got an event on not just initializing. So we've got Elspeth and George with us. So Elspeth Minty is the global lead of the Java platform engineering team at Morgan Stanley. She joined Morgan Stanley in London in 2001 and has worked in Shanghai for 8 years before moving to Montreal in 2018. So Elspeth's been a hands-on technologist throughout her career and worked extensively with C++ and Java. We also have George, and George Ball is a developer in the Java platform engineering team at Morgan Stanley, where he's involved primarily in helping migrate the firm's Java platform to a modern cloud-friendly architecture. He's been working with Java and JVM since their earliest days. So George, Elspeth, I'll hand over to you.
Cool, thank you very much. It's good to be here. So we're going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing over the last probably couple of years, and ongoing work on the what we're calling the Initializer platform. So Initializer is the server side that underpins the start.spring.io website. So what we are looking to do as part of this work is to think about developer productivity. How do we make ourselves more productive? As a developer, I want to be doing the new interesting stuff. I don't want to be reinventing code that someone else has already come up with before. I don't want to be writing boilerplate code. I want to make use of the tools that are there to support me to do this. It's why we use IDEs. It's why we use frameworks like Spring to give us reusable functionality, and it's why we use a whole host of tooling, around testing and other things to make sure that the time that we spend developing, we are actually doing the kind of new and interesting stuff in the job. So picture the scene. We've just been approved to do a new project. We've got all these ideas floating around in our head about all the cool new architectures we're going to try out, the new libraries we want to make use of. all the stuff that we're going to do. So you're sitting in front of your computer, you open up a new project in your IDE, and you're confronted by an empty editor. I don't know about anyone else on this call, but the idea of empty editors absolutely terrifies me. I just want to fill them full of code. And what I usually end up doing is just taking a piece of code from another project and copying it over and starting from that. And this is a really terrible thing to do. It's the perfect way to copy bad practice. The same piece of code starts aging out, and it moves from project to project to project, and it's just really not a good thing to do. A better way to do this would be to take a piece of example code and start from that. It's more likely to be up to date and more likely to be showing the best practice way of doing things. But it's probably not going to do exactly what I want. I'm probably going to end up taking bits out of the example, putting combining bits from other examples, and to end up with something that is hacking it around to end up with something that is what I'm looking for. And even then, there's more to the projects than just the code. There's the build files, the CI, deployment scripts, all the other stuff that comes with modern applications. So there's a lot of scaffolding that needs to be put in place. And this is where tools like start.spring.io come in. And for people like me who are empty editor phobes, these things are a godsend. I can go to this site, I can pick the types of projects that I'm interested in, pick the starters that I'm interested in, and it will generate me something that I can start from. And this is hugely useful. So probably about 18 months or so ago, George and I were talking about this, and he pointed out that start.spring.io is an open source project. So we were thinking, why don't we just bring it in-house, see if we could configure it up. Maybe we can even offer some of our own proprietary libraries through it. But let's give it a go, see what people think, and see what kind of feedback we get. And this is where MS Initializr comes in. Those of you who might know Morgan Stanley know that we like sticking MS on the front of everything. So we have MS Initializr. It looks a little bit different from the public version, and that's because at the time I took the snapshots, we're running a slightly older version. It now is using the same UI. But it's pretty much the same with a few customizations that we wanted to make. So we only support Java. The open source version supports Kotlin and Groovy as well. But within Morgan Stanley, Java is the only one of those three languages that we support. We also limit the Spring Boot versions that are available to production versions. We don't support snapshot or pre-release versions, and that's just a decision that we made about what we want to make available in this way. We also, it's not obvious through the UI, but we also don't go directly to Maven Central for the dependencies. We have an in-house product that caches open source repositories, and we actually use that behind the scenes. But we were able to just use standard Spring Boot starters. So the same ones that you see in the open source version are available in MS Initializr. And we were also able to make our proprietary code available in the same way. So you can go to MS Initializr, you can pick, for example, a Spring Reactive web service, and then you can pick the Morgan Stanley Reactive Authentication Starter. So that we have ways very easily of combining the proprietary code with the public code. We have a few of these kind of starters available in-house. At the moment, it's largely authentication, the corporate directory, some database, but we're slowly starting to expand these out. So we configured this up. George wrote a blog on it, and we kind of published it out and let people know it was there. And we were really taken aback by the reaction that we got. Our users really liked it. You know, they loved it and they wanted more from it. So we started thinking about what else can we do with Initializer. And about the same time, we saw a presentation that Stefan Nickel, the developer behind Initializer, he gave a presentation on how to use Initializer to generate an empty file. And that seems like a really trivial thing to do, but it was a real light bulb moment for us. You know, we know that Initializer can generate Spring applications. You know, that's the entire point of it. But the fact that you can generate an empty file and you can generate a full-blown Spring application, you can generate pretty much anything. If you can do those, you can do everything in the middle. So we started to realize that we could really make use of Initializer as a platform to generate not just the build files that it does in the open source versions, the minimal bits of code, but to take the ideas that allow it to do that and really build upon it to produce a much richer platform, and particularly use it to make best practice the easiest thing for our developers to do. So the sorts of things that we were thinking about and the sorts of things that we realized were going to be possible were things like, well, if we can use Initializer to generate build files for Maven and Gradle, then we can probably generate default configuration for our CI and deployment systems. If we can use it to generate the small amount of code that it does in the open source version, just the very simple entry points, then we can generate more code. And we can generate code at the moment, we can generate projects. If you look at Initializer in the open source, if you pick different versions of the JDK or different Spring versions, the actual set of initializers, of starters that you can see changes. So depending on what you're choosing, you can selectively display different content. So what we realized with that was that we could take that, and yes, we can generate code, but we can also generate code that is specific to the starters that have been selected. So for example, if I select reactive starters, I generate a reactive example. If I select a normal web service, then I get a normal example. So all these kind of functionality is already built into the platform. So I'm going to hand over to George to talk in a bit more detail about how this works and the functionality that Initializer provides to allow us to do this.
Thanks, Elspeth. So we had these ideas that were sort of flowing amongst us, that of all the things that we'd like to do with the Initializer platform, and so it seems natural that one should go away and dig around and find a little bit more out about how it actually works. And so we spent a fair bit of time looking into this. Initializer, as provided by the Spring platform itself, has been around for quite a number of years, and it started off rather like where we started, with a group of the developers from the core Spring team, looking for ways in which they could simplify the process of getting started building Spring applications. Because as anyone who knows, who's worked with Spring, there is a tendency to lean towards a lot of boilerplate code, and if we can get some help in doing that, it's going to make our lives a little bit better. So back in 2013, the first version Spring Initializr was written, and it was started off in a very simple way as a basic web application, heavily driven by textual templating and implemented in Groovy on the server itself, with a pretty basic web front end on it. I think the guys who built that had the same experience as we did when they let it loose to the developers that were interested in it, because it was taken up very, very quickly, and it became clear that this was a tool that had a future. And so they formed a more formalized team to actually work on it, and the product itself evolved significantly over the years. It's now completely different. It's been completely re-engineered, and exists as a fairly sophisticated Spring Boot application in its own right. So the user interface that people may well be familiar with from their first meeting with this tool is, as we've already said, start.spring.io, this sort of public website, which again, the UI has evolved into something fairly sophisticated these days, where you select all the main properties that you want your project to have in terms of language, build tool, versions of Spring Boot that we're going to support, and what dependencies, what components we want to incorporate into our application. And then we just push the magic button that says generate this project for me. And then if we're lucky, then what comes back to us is a zip file with the project already in it. But what's actually going on here is that when the button is pressed, then a request has been parceled up and sent across to a backend, to a server. It's a RESTful service. Again, as I say, a standard Spring Boot RESTful service. And the REST API fronts the heavy lifting, if you like, at the back, which is actually a set of libraries, which we call the Initializer, which we call the Spring Initializer libraries. And their main job is to respond to these RESTful requests that are coming in. And the libraries themselves are written in such a way that they can be configured and controlled very significantly through metadata. So if you imagine the RESTful API comes in that says, build me a Java project with a Groovy build, with a Gradle build system for Spring Boot 2.3 with the following dependencies, we know that that's all possible because we have the necessary information encoded in metadata at the Initializer end, which does the hard work for us. There are other options from the web page as well. If you've seen this already, you can ask to see what the project is going to look like without necessarily parceling it up and sending it back over to the client. Or you can actually capture an instance of the build request so that it can be replayed at some point in the future. But these are all essentially requests going into this API, which fronts the library at the back end. Now, having the REST API at the front opens up a few more possibilities to us, because it means that we're not just restricted to having a web-based front end. And the developers of Spring Initializer realized this quite early on. And what they've done is that, or what they have enabled by building this RESTful API is for alternative front ends to be made visible to people to use. And those take the form largely of plugins for most of the common IDEs that Java developers use. And so there are plugins available for IntelliJ, which is the one that we use a lot. There's a plugin for VS Code, plugin for Eclipse, plugin for NetBeans. And all of them present the same information, exactly the same information that you see on the web page, obviously in different ways, and they allow the RESTful requests to be sent off to the generator, to the Initializer, which does all of the work and produces the project. In the case of these IDEs, it's really nice because what you end up with is a ready-to-use project and loaded and basically imported into the IDE as a new project. It's very powerful. It turns out figures from the Initializer team tell us that probably half of the use cases for the projects that are generated by Initializer are generated using the web front end, and half of them are generated using the IDE plugins. Of course, there's a third option as well, which is the command line, because we have tools now like wget or curl or HTTP, other command line HTTP clients, and so they can be made to submit the same HTTP request that the IDE or the plugins emit into the RESTful API, and have the projects returned to them as well there. And having the command line interface opens up all sorts of other possibilities, because it opens us towards the ideas of scripting this kind of operation to build and manage projects. So if we can actually provide the necessary capabilities in the generator, then we're faced with the possibilities of building a fairly sophisticated set of tools for our developers to use. But of course, to take a look at this, we need to see what happens behind the scenes. And again, it turns out, if you investigate this, as Elspeth's already said, it's open source. It's been developed following the sort of best practices of Spring Boot. And it turns out it is actually quite highly configurable. The requests that come in from the RESTful API are unpacked and formatted into a document that we call a project description. It's just a representation of all the selections that were made at the front end, and these are passed in to the main worker component, which is a generator, and the project generator is where the low level capabilities take place. And the project generator has the built-in functionality of being able to create file system hierarchies and text files. It doesn't know anything about what goes into those text files. It just gives you the capability of doing this, creating a file, putting some text into it, and positioning it at a particular point in a file hierarchy, which is essentially what we're looking at creating here, a template or a skeleton project as a hierarchy in the right format for whatever the selected build environment was going to be. And when Elspeth said, that we can use generator to create an empty file, a project that just contains an empty file, it seems a kind of pointless thing to do when you look at it like that. But what it does say is that we have effectively very fine-grained control at a low level of what we're actually generating. But of course, what we're looking at doing here is providing a much higher level interface for the developers. And so we want to say, well, build me a Spring Boot project. The current way that start.spring.io is all configured through its metadata is essentially to build a Spring Boot project with all the necessary pieces in place. And it makes use of Spring Boot's amazing auto configuration capabilities to allow this project to actually glue together in the correct way. But interestingly, it also uses Spring Boot's auto configuration capabilities, and it extends them slightly so that every request that comes in causes the creation of a Spring context. Remember, a Spring context is just a collection of Spring beans. And every time we're going to generate a project, we do all the clever stuff by using a collection of Spring beans, which are grouped together into the context. And so based on the high level request that we get, the generator can build this, and it can fill it full of Spring beans that we call contributors or customizers. Okay, so that in the project generation context, what we end up with is essentially a skeleton directory structure that we're going to build, and we bring in a collection of these beans. We create a collection of these beans into the context using this extension of Spring Boot's auto configuration and conditional inclusion of beans into a context that happens for us already. So a contributor bean is essentially something which adds a component into the project. Basically, that's what gives us the text files, if you like, that get put in. And there are different contributors for the different components that are going to be placed there. There are also customizers, and these customizers can be used to actually adjust the work that's being done after a contributor has finished its job. So, you know, we could be creating a raw text file with some very generic information in it, and then we use a customizer to polish that into what it is we're trying to build. And it turns out that the reason that we use that start.spring.io or Initializer, if you like, the reason it is able to build and configure a Spring Boot project ready for us to use is because there are a set of appropriate contributors and customizers that know all the rules that are needed to make a Spring Boot application. They know some of the cross-module dependencies that need to be maintained. And they essentially enforce the rules that we need to follow to get the project in the right way. So that's essentially how this all works. Now, the project, the conditional inclusion of these beans, as I said already, is like an extension of what Spring Boot does normally in its auto configuration. And so, for example, to give an obvious example, we're usually offered the choice of using generating a project that will use Maven as a build tool, or alternatively that will use Gradle as a build tool. Now, if you choose Maven, then there's no point in adding any of the Gradle configuration files into the project that you're generating. Similarly, obviously, the same applies and vice versa. So if you're building a Gradle, then we don't want to be generating a pom.xml file, for example, in our project. So we know the generator, through the correct inclusion of contributors and customizers, knows those things and makes sure that it can be achieved. So if you think, we've got the contributors and customizers which are processed by the generator as it's building the context, and that will cause certain of these beans to be instantiated and loaded into the context. And once that's been done, then each of them will be called using the standard interface that they all meet, and they'll all do their work. Now, there is also, I should say, just like there is with Spring Boot auto configuration, there is the concept of ordering of these beans, because in many cases the order in which things happen is to be significant. But it is a remarkably flexible way of actually going about doing these things. And once each of those beans has been called and done its work, we're left with our skeleton file system directory hierarchy, which is then packaged up, if that's what's required, and sent back to the client. And in this case, you've got the choice of packaging it as a zip file or as a tar.gz file, and then that gets sent back as a response to the initial RESTful request. Okay, so it turns out that this is a very open and flexible way of doing things. And when you discover that the fact that we can build a Spring Boot app by just through the appropriate choice of these contributors and customizers, it opens up all sorts of possibilities as to other things that you can do. And so what we're doing now is we're beginning to reorganize and develop new contributors and customizers to allow us to do other things. And these, you know, if you think about it, we don't even have to be building Java applications to this. You know, these are just text files that are being generated for us. The tool as it stands will build Kotlin or Groovy projects for you if you ask it, again, just through the choice of different contributors and customizers. But we feel that we can take it even further than that. We feel that we can build things that are other than just Spring Boot applications. We feel that we can build, we can use this to initialize projects that are, for example, constructing libraries that are then going to be made available to other development teams as themselves Spring Boot starters, so that they can be fitted in through this platform. We believe that we do not have to build Spring Boot applications and focus just on that. There isn't any reason necessarily why we can't use the same capabilities here to build applications Java applications, perhaps that aren't going to be controlled and managed by Spring Boot. And so we're looking at ways of doing that, and it's generally down to including the right contributors and the right customizers at the point where the context is itself being built. The core package itself uses simply jar files for grouping together these collections of customizers and contributors that carry the knowledge to do things like building Spring Boot applications, and essentially packages them up as libraries. If the libraries are on the class path, then Initializer will find them and check to see if it needs to include them. That's again how Spring Boot works, how it does all of its magic. And so these libraries are essentially appear as plugins. You can consider them as plugins for the back-end generation. And we're looking for ways of organizing these plugins in a more flexible and extensible way, possibly looking at leveraging the JPMS, the jigsaw capabilities of the JVM itself, to make it possible for us to build and deploy different instances of Initializer that are targeted at using different dependency sets, if you like, so that we can perhaps allow other development teams to have their own customized versions of Initializer that they can then use to expose their capabilities and get the same thing. Okay. We're also planning to, and we're actually making some good progress on this at the moment, is being able to generate more infrastructure level configuration and possibly code to go along with the projects. One of the areas that I think frustrates maybe Java developers a lot is having to build their code and some of the boilerplate that surrounds fitting into a CI/CD pipeline, for example, or configuration to deploy into certain target areas, different cloud environments, and so on. And we feel that it's definitely possible to be building configuration from Initializer, which will respond to input that specifies what we're looking for and generate the necessary files and have those going on in. But one of the more interesting areas, and we were asked about this interestingly right from the very beginning, is that Initializer itself is by its very name something you use to get started with a project. It's essentially something that we use to create a project so that people can get started with it easily. But we were constantly asked, well, can we use this capability on an existing project? Can we actually take an existing project and put it into Initializer and do stuff with it? And now, you know, if you've ever thought about this, if you've ever tried to do it, you'll know this is a pretty difficult problem. You know, it is questionably unsolvable in the general case. But when we thought about it, we began to think, well, maybe we can actually do something along these lines to help. For example, you may have created a project just as a bare Java project to start with, and then you decide that you maybe want to put this into a CI/CD pipeline. And wouldn't it be nice if we could just generate the boilerplate that's needed to fit into a CI/CD pipeline and somehow wrap it around the existing project? Or perhaps we've built using a particular version of Spring Boot. A new version of Spring Boot has become available, and we would like to make that change, and simply by changing the version of Spring Boot, in our project specification, we would get the updates to all the dependent versions cascading down through the rest of the project, and again minimize the amount of effort that would have to be done. So we see this platform that we're constructing here is not just an Initializer platform. We feel that there is the scope to take it further and do some really quite exciting things to make the developers' lives an awful lot easier. Back to Elspeth, I think.
And even beyond what George has been talking about, there longer term, we're seeing more ways in which we can use this. So for example, a lot of applications nowadays, they're there's more than one component to more than one module within an application. Even leaving aside microservices, most applications will have configuration services. There's probably some kind of monitoring service. There might be a gateway. There's a lot of moving parts in modern applications. So rather than just building a single application at a time, can we build the complete system with the gateway, with the configuration service? We're also wondering about, or thinking that it would be possible to use Initializer to kind of build more complete services. So for example, something like Spring Cloud Gateway is available as a library. You write the code that you need to compile it up, configure it, and release it. That's exactly the sort of thing that we can use Initializer to do as well. So we kind of had this idea about maybe using the API to walk people through how to set up a Spring Cloud Gateway. What are the kind of things that you need to think about, and then take those answers and generate the configuration. And then, as George said, I guess the holy grail of the project is can we use it to update something? I mean, I think the idea of using Initializer to be able to migrate and extend is something that we want to explore more. I think that is probably possible. I agree completely with George that the really general update functionality is probably well beyond what we want to do. But being able to just take an example, take a piece of code and put the deployment around it, change the deployment platform. There's a lot of projects. They're not necessarily deploying just into one type of platform. Some are private cloud, some are public clouds. There's different public cloud vendors. There's differences in the way these, in the setup that's required for these different platforms. And this is the type of thing where Initializer, I think, has a role to play in being able to help people move from one to the other. So these are some of the things that we've been looking at with Initializer, and some of the things that we expect to, or we're looking at doing over the next few years. But it's really, I think we've been surprised by just how flexible the platform is. We've done this without really without making any changes to Initializer. We've used the functionality that's already there. It's a really nice piece of design for doing this kind of work with. So yeah, that was everything we wanted to say. So thank you for your time.
Thank you both. That was really interesting. Have we got any questions? There was lots and lots of interesting things being discussed there. So I'm sure some people have a question or two. I've got one to start with, which is I've actually used Spring Initializer a bit, but George and I have got grey hair. We've used a lot of code generators over the years, going back to, I guess early C++ before it had frameworks. We used code generators with it. And the problem I've had repeatedly is that the generator team create more clever, more sophisticated application bundles that are generated. And the teams are very grateful for them because it gives them a huge kickstart and it gets them productive very fast. And then something goes wrong in the middle of it and they change some configuration, which they thought they understood, but they don't. And it all blows up in some very unexpected way in an integration test. And then a lot of the productivity kind of gets went back because actually they have to kind of go in and learn how it all works, and that causes them quite a lot of problems, and then that causes a sort of negative feedback about the whole approach. Have you had any of those problems at Morgan Stanley, and how did you, if you did, what did you do about them?
We haven't we haven't yet, but I think it is absolutely a valid concern. I mean, I think we are looking at this as a way to produce fairly bog standard applications pretty quickly. It's not something that's going to hit 100% of applications. You know, it's the ones where it's just really out the box stuff that people are doing. I think as soon as you start changing things, you have to understand what you're doing, or you're going to end up in exactly the situation you described. And you know, maybe this is still a way to get you faster to that point. But I think if you are at the stage where you're making changes and you don't understand what you're doing or what the impact of what you're doing is, then there's very little that these kind of systems can do to help that.
Sure. I think the actual the way in which the dependencies are presented to the developers as they're navigating their way through as well can have some part to play with this. You know, that there are the Initializer platform itself has the scope for you annotating the dependencies with additional properties, and these often include links out to documentation. These often, you know, so there are ways in which again we can extend it a little bit further. I mean, the core Initializer platform itself doesn't really generate any code for you, bar the entry point. And so what we're trying to do is to produce not necessarily a working application, but an illustration of how these dependencies are meant to be used. And what we're, you know, some of the challenges are going to be, of course, trying to match different dependencies put together. You know, so for example, if you want to select dependencies to build a RESTful web service with our authentication in it, then you will get generated for you a very simple but a working REST controller with the endpoints authenticated. And you know, speaking as you know, someone who's been on the end of requests for help from Java developers inside the firm, that's the number of times we're asked that question is incredible. And you know, giving people a working example and say, well, this is how you do it. I know I take your point that we could be hiding a nest of vipers, as it were. But at the moment, what we'd find is that the benefits here are getting over stuff, which is, you know, it's letting people get started and play with it and discover things from that. And that's kind of where we want to try and take people. It's just so much time spent wrestling with infrastructure code whenever you use a framework of any kind.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, what we want to do is try and lift that away as far as we can, so that we can, so that people can focus on what they're trying to do.
Okay, thanks.
I had a question. I wonder if you had any, like, obviously now as we start to move away from just kind of getting a Spring Boot application up and running and starting to add more, I guess, generated configuration, or even just with your own libraries that you're pulling in, you do get to this point where dependencies and other things will just explode in complexity. And I wondered if you were running any sorts of like automated tests or end-to-end tests against the application that's doing the initialization. I think, George, you mentioned that you can use like the REST APIs. I just wondered, yeah, what the strategy around that would be.
Jim, I'm not sure you're allowed to ask us questions.
Oh, sorry. I'll be quiet.
Jim's one of our customers.
So this is something that we are doing, but we need to do more of, because I think it's one of the things with it that you get with Initializer is this kind of guarantee that the versions of Spring libraries that are there have been tested together and they work together, and that's the kind of guarantee that we want to be able to make as well. So yeah, we do test. We do have, obviously we have automated tests for the stuff that goes out. One of the nice things about the way that we've done the code generation, I mean, I'm allowed to say that because I didn't write any of it, is that we compile everything. as we generate it, we compile it to make sure that it's correct. But I think we also want to take a kind of longer look, because we're using this for proprietary libraries as well. We can use this to kind of test our proprietary libraries with different versions of different bits of Spring Boot, different versions of Java, by using Initializer within the library test to generate the example test code as well. That's something we were actually just discussing doing this morning, and how we might go about doing this. But I think for me, that's the kind of next big thing on the testing is really to get this, to kind of flip it around and get Initializer used as part of the testing for our own libraries.
It's one of the strong selling points that Spring themselves use for start.spring.io is that it manages what they call, and Spring Boot to be fair, they're managing what they call a curated set of dependencies, and that's the key thing, is the curated set. So the metadata that we load in will say that if it's configured in such a way that if you select a version of Spring Boot at a particular level, it may affect the dependencies that you're offered, because they may not be supported or they may not have been fully tested through. And we're hoping to take that, or we intend to take that forward with our the dependencies that we're producing and that we're allowing people to produce. I think what we need, one of the key things, is going to be a process, hopefully backed by some tooling, which is going to make it easier for people in the firm to develop their own libraries and integrate them into this. And part of that will clearly have to be, what are the restrictions on how this can be used in terms of other dependencies.
Yeah.
Cool. No, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Is that it?
Okay, I think everyone else is being shy. So thank you very much to Elspeth and George. Really fascinating stuff. Thanks for taking the time tonight to share.
Not at all. Thank you very much for having us.
Not at all.
It's been a pleasure. Nice to see you again, Owen.
And you, George. Nice to meet you, Elspeth. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
We'll see you at the next time.
Thanks to everyone. Bye.